Get my little clickety-clack opening logo going. Welcome to Evolution Hour on a hot day in Spokane here, where we got Jackson and Jonathan Baker. Going to have some wonderful time here. There's our little tortucanwordpress.com, Troubles in Paradise, Methodology of Creationism, the teeny tiny little project that has been occupying my benighted soul for the last couple decades on here. And there we go. We'll see whether or not our chat line's coming along here. Let's put a message in there. Hi, all. See, that's when I want to find out whether or not I'm getting the thing there. Audience members will be well aware of Jackson. Lavender Lady. Hi there, Diana. One of our patrons. Let's introduce Jonathan Baker, who has joined as an other talking vertebrate on the subject. I basically have known him in two different guises because he's Ages of Rocks on social media, and then Jonathan Baker in other contexts. This is how I cited you in the book. And so it was a while before light bulb dawned over my head. Same people. There you go. So anyway, give a brief introduction to yourself here.
Sure. Glad to be here. Yeah, I'm a geologist. My PhD was in paleoclimatology and isotope geochemistry. So but I've been long interested in tracking down, countering, communicating with various forms of pseudoscience, everything from climate issues to creationism of sorts. So,
and boy, are we busy on that one.
Yeah, but I have noticed it is a good way to learn geology, to take a claim that is out there and just figuring out how to answer that claim or track down test the claim that they might make. You learn a lot just getting all the context together, tracking down their sources and so forth.
And that's been the same case. I'm not a degreed scientist. I have a BA in history, but I'm interested in the matter. And so the things that I have come to learn is because I'm following up the source material, reading the technical papers. Anybody that if you hit a technical paper and it's like Martian, that means you don't understand it yet. You need to study it until you do, in which case you will be better off and you will be able to understand it better. And an awful lot of ones that we encounter in the anti-evolution biz are people that don't get past the Fox News coverage on these matters instead of reading the technical papers. So let me stick up my, whoops, let me share screen again to share our patrons, because I always like to, whoops. Come on, there we go. I am an old fart, and it's always a matter of navigating around the screen on the laptop here in a clumsy, oafish way. There's our sharing of the window. Thank you for everybody that has been helping our patrons all during this period. As a Social Security retiree, it makes a big difference on there. I'd like to thank our colleagues, Hendril, Colton, Eric Rowley, Suris, and Zeshi, our researchers, Travis Adams, Ian Chen, Convert Me, Stephen Early, Eat Meal, James Fitzwater, History Minor, Ralph McFadden, Paulogia, Benjamin Simpson, Speed of Sound, Studio DM Wing, our assistant researchers, Command Cyborg, Dolronku, Jelly, the Lavender Lady, who is in our field, Totus Real, Christopher Johnson, Steve Bauman on the friends level, Marigale Beddoes, Daniel, Insects are cool, aren't they? Martin Nielsen, Paul the Skeptic, Puffalophagus, Bo Rasmussen, Devin Reeves, Alex Stone, and Paul Williams, and our legacy patrons who have helped at one point or another. It's been a difference. Jen, Jody, Mike, John, Keith, Andrew, Yoey, Mona, Brad, Daniel, Nana, Stagel, Sun, Skystone, Ugly German Truths, Everett, and Sewer. You've all been a wonderful help to all of that. So now on to the actual program as usual. For those who are following, you'll be hearing this for the umpteenth time. For those who you haven't, I'm doing a source methods analysis for replacing Darwin. This does not replace Darwin. This is Nathaniel Jeanson, young Earth creationist geneticist, sort of, who is insisting that he has determined that life on Earth cannot be more than a few thousand years old, and the genetics proves it incontrovertibly, based upon his own detailed papers that have convinced absolutely no one in the genetic community outside of the young Earth creationist and himself. And so I've been going through this particular chapter 7 is one that took a different turn because there's an awful lot of stealth creationism in there. In the first 6 chapters, he really avoided alluding to his creationist buddies. But in this particular chapter, he's banged it up to where now it's like a third of his sources are just creationists when you start taking into account all of that material. But it's buried off in the footnotes. And often the same material, he'll trot it out 2, 3, 4 times. And now he's down in incestuous level, because this whole section on mitochondrial DNA is all Jeanson telling you why Jeanson's right. And a couple weeks ago, Jonathan, I'd done a bit which was calling attention to the fact, oh, Jeanson gets his core numbers on mutation rates really, really wrong. He tries to calculate how many mutations there should be if human beings were 100,000 years old and other critters were as old as evolution and naturalism says they are. And then he measures the actual values and it's way tiny. And therefore this proves that they cannot be very old. He's getting mutation rates off by a factor
orders of magnitude.
10.
Yeah. I do remember that. That was pretty bad.
Yeah. And this was unconscionably stupid. Well, he does the same trick here with the mitochondrial DNA regarding Neanderthals. And what was interesting is he's talking about how he claims that only 213 mitochondrial DNA differences separate Neanderthals and modern humans based on his, quote, own personal analysis. And then that's lower than the predicted 955 to 9,211 mutations based upon his own special analysis, which, yeah, we got to wonder whether that's true. But the funky part came when I was trying to verify whether even that mitochondrial number was accurate. Turns out he was exaggerating that too. So I'm putting up a linkage to a Smithsonian posting which covers the issue of human origins and the DNA issue. And they had a point where they're saying most human sequences differ from each other by an average of 8 substitutions, while the human and chimpanzee sequences differ by about 55 substitutions. The Neanderthal and modern human sequences differed by approximately 27.2 substitutions, not 213. And then regarding their mitochondrial DNA, they went even further and noted Briggs's 2009 paper, which I will be putting a link to. It's an open access one. I found a thing at Academia EDU on that little puppy, where the Neanderthal mtDNA genomes differ from each other by 20.4 bases and are only 1/3 as diverse as modern humans. Now, curiously enough, although, because I keep track of what gets cited and what doesn't in the anti-evolution biz, Briggs's paper is shown up as being cited by an anti-evolutionist, but not Jeanson. Jeanson doesn't cite it in this book so far, and his technical papers that he has alluded to from 2013, 2015, 2016, and all that make no reference to it. So if he knows about it, it ain't in that material. Why would you think to have an understanding of mitochondrial DNA from Neanderthals and not have hit that paper as one of the benchmarks in the field, if only even to criticize it? Jackson, you have something to say about that?
Well, creationists misunderstanding data, or not at all, not even trying. Surprise.
It's such a consistent pattern that in the pre-show when Jonathan and I were talking, I'm just saying that I use it, Gish as the exemplar here, that if any anti-evolutionist makes a bold claim based on scientific technical literature that they've gone out of their way to cite that sounds like, well, boy, that sure helps their case, presume that it probably isn't, and that you need to track it down and find the original full text to find out what's going on here. And it's a delightful enterprise. And I've been recommending to anybody. Nobody can be a polymath. They can't necessarily pay attention to absolutely everything, but everybody's got an area of interest. You've got your geology, Jonathan. Jackson's got his biology. I'm interested in a bunch of different fields. So you can home in on things where you really get your flame going and analyze that. And anybody that can do YouTubes, if I can do it, anybody can. there's nothing in principle to say that you can't come in and do a source analysis on that material as well. So that's the general rule of what was going on here.
Yeah, I was going to mention too, like as far as leaving out papers like this is the advantage of going through a proper peer review, because it's not uncommon that we miss a paper, a recent one, a relevant one, and that's okay. I mean, it happens a lot, but that's something that an editor or a reviewer will immediately spot and ask you to add it in, discuss the relevance, explain any discrepancies and so forth. But it's, you know, a process that they've, I think by choice, isolated themselves from. I mean, they might say that, well, we can't just publish, we can't try to publish in secular journals as though there's such a thing.
It's the conspiracy.
The Answers research journal is peer reviewed by other creationists.
Well, it's their conspiracy. You know, we can't do it because everyone's against us.
And this is why it's fun to read the different camps, because ICR's bunch at Acts and Facts and their group, and then the Answers in Genesis cluster, and then you have CMI, which had divorced from Answers in Genesis some years back over financial fiddling that they didn't like Ken Ham doing. So that's why they separated all the kids. So some of the creationist AIG stuff is at CMI, not at Answers in Genesis. On that heat matter, that's where you can clearly see camp number one over in ICR following one model, and AIG's in-house group following a different model, and CMI favoring another one, and they're all battling in the footnotes over what is the correct material, which you'd never spot unless you read more than one of their creationist apologetic sources.
Yeah. You know, I mean, as much as they try to say, like, oh, yeah, we couldn't publish in these regular journals, which is where they should be, and include whatever. If they think it's a worthy discussion, then they should put it there. And it doesn't have to be something that would be prejudicially dismissed. And, you know, it doesn't have to be a paper that's written explicitly talking about this biblical timeline, and that's their motivation for testing this model. I mean, they can put it in just as a paper saying, look, we think that the conventional divergence times for these species is either too old or we've miscalculated substitution rates, because look, our model shows that it should be this many differences, not this many.
Yeah, that would have passed muster just from a secular point of view if they weren't trying to put the extra axis.
Right. There's no reason a paper like that couldn't be published and you know, join the community for discussion,
unless of course
really
missed a lot of documentation,
right, which they do, and I think it should be pointed out to anybody who's sympathetic to Jeanson, you know, wants to believe that he's got this testable prediction that he's found to be robust. It should be pointed out that they're not being dismissed from journals like this because of some religious bias. It's because their methodologies don't pass. They don't stand up to any reasonable test, and their interpretations are not justified by the data. And when other peers point that out, you know, we've got Dan in the chat here. I know he's taken close looks at this, and he's not the only one. But when other experts in the field point out that the methodology is bad, that the interpretations aren't justified, like this is something of a peer review, they won't accept it. And even with like the Answers research journal, they for some of these journals, they will send it out to people who may not necessarily be young Earth creationists, but when they get the feedback, they don't listen to that reviewer at all. I mean, I have a couple friends who have been reviewers for those articles, and gave their feedback, gave their criticisms, and basically redlined the entire paper. And it got published in form anyways. So
well, and we know that Snelling still publishes now and then in regular journals. There's quite a few creationists that in fact aren't blackballed, but if they're going to mark their specifically creationist material, they're going to have to do way better than all of that. That gigantic database that was compiled in part by Kurt Wise, but definitely, I can't remember whether it was Whitmore or no, the guy with the C. I've forgotten his stupid name. Anyway, he was the one that they went through and compiled this gigantic data field of thousands of dissertations and technical papers about the direction of flow of water in various geological contexts, and created this monster data set. It was posted at one of the Nature websites. Anybody can deal with it. And that's the problem, is because anybody can look into that data field. It's all very accurate information, except creationists take that and they misrepresent their own data field to where they're implying that they can literally measure the stuff coming in during the flood and the arrows of the direction coming out during the flood. And when you start actually looking at the data field, it doesn't match. Where are they pulling this out of? And their own data that they've actually assembled themselves. The part 2 of the show has to do with our cute little pal Behemoth and one of the biblical pests. And it happens to be that Paul Price, bless his heart, the young earth creationist, just put up a posting last year at creation.com, which would be the Not Answers in Genesis cluster, where he was complaining about a relatively short video by creationism critic Ben Stanhope, who was jettisoning all the prosaic explanations of what Behemoth might be, that it was a hippopotamus or some physical animal, but that it was probably a more mythological bull monster thing. And along the way, he happened to mention something about its tail, which is a feature that modern scholarship has pretty much accepted is a euphemism for penises. And they're talking about the loins and all of that stuff. And this just threw Price into ballistic orbit. He didn't like that at all. And Stanhope wrote a couple of different responses to him, and I'm putting the links to all of that stuff on there. I couldn't resist quoting a thing that it'll be in the new book about. I'm being a historian, I'm aware of old style writing and the stuff that would be in the Darwin era, and how sublimely vicious a lot of this scholarship was in terms of rhetoric. And Stanhope pilloried Price at one point in a way that I haven't seen that level of vitriol since the Victorian era. And I will go into, are you eating something, Jackson?
Am I eating something? No.
I'm getting a strange side sound coming in there.
I wasn't even near the phone, but it's kind of breaking up now.
Yeah. That's an odd thing. It sounded like we had somebody eating a big candy bar.
Let me try leaving. Coming back.
Curse your new Louisiana internet. He may have to come back up. He has absolutely terrible internet on there, and that's one of the reasons why he tends not to even run the camera. I have a mediocre internet here, but it's like Rolls Royce by comparison to what they got in blasted Louisiana.
Yeah, ours is decent, but unreliable. Just cut out now and then when you use the
Anyway, I will read with a proper English accent this riposte that Stanhope took to Price. Many of you darling, naive old-timers with academic education within the memorial halls of Western theology are probably thinking that Price's accusation here that he is a liberal means Rob and I advocate for that complex theological project birthed in the late 18th century Germanic tradition of Schleiermacher that matured into the Princeton modernist controversy. Maybe we subscribe to the Bushnellian critique of the atonement. Maybe we chat approvingly between cigar drags about Munger's emphasis of true religion, not as doctrine but living, or of the ecumenical value of Rudolf Otzo's sensus numinus. You know, the actual defining hallmarks of the tradition of theological liberalism. I haven't seen such snark in decades.
I really loved that section from Stanhope, and he's absolutely right that especially in the modern era, they've totally conflated what they think of as political liberalism with theological liberalism. They just put the two together and kind of use it as a buzzword to turn off their audience from whomever they're talking about, and it's really annoying. Theological liberalism is a completely separate movement. It's still active today, but most people that they would call theological liberals are not in that camp whatsoever.
Loosey-goosey use of words shows up in the general use of the word liberal. I mean, Dinesh D'Souza uses it as practically a curse word. You liberal. You just
Well, it's
practically see
become
it
like that in a
teeth.
lot of circles. It's just an easy way to
Yeah.
throw it. Well, it's and label, but it's not technically an insult. It's just but
Yeah,
it is
and
meant like that.
it carries baggage. Critical race theory has taken on exactly that same dynamic of where, you know, how many people have actually even bothered to read anybody that's actually done something in that area, as opposed to just using it as a little buzzword to connect up with socialism and communism and Ocasio-Cortez, you know,
Yeah.
as a little train wreck. Off there in the left with Bernie Sanders. No, it gets to be an absolute mess. And I, as a historian who have had to weasel through all of these little areas, you have to understand the politics if you're looking at the fracas between Stephen Jay Gould and Richard Dawkins and John Maynard Smith back in the 1970s and 80s on sociobiology with E.O. Wilson. Now it's evolutionary psychology, that you can't approach these things without understanding the political context of it, but there's more to it than that, and you can't just dive into it on that little front. Anyway, good old Price. I brought up some various show and tells about this because we have to remember the creationist dogma on, Jackson is back. Okay, there we go. Hopefully your connection will be a little better than the one that was coming through on the squirrel wheel. Are you there, Jackson?
Maybe.
We'll see. Okay. Anyway, I was doing some show and tell. I brought up the Brontosaurus, aka Apatosaurus, from my little British Museum collection, which is the standard model in creationist circles of what they think effing behemoth was. And why? Because it can make its tail stiff like a cedar, which means obviously it was as big as a cedar tree, like, right? Well, of course, don't you notice the big long neck too, and the gigantic body? On this scale, a human being is only this big. Wouldn't they have spotted this stuff and mentioned it in the text if it were like that big of an animal? Or worse, if you move over to Ken Ham territory and some of theirs, they want to have even bigger Brachiosaurus as behemoth. Let's go for broke, although its tail is not quite nearly so long as your little Apatosaurus in there. But anybody that reads the original text, unless they're King James only groupies, only learns the text says that behemoth can make its tail stiff like a cedar. Kind of like this spatula is as stiff as a cedar. Oh, it hurts when I do that. And this, ironically enough, is about the same size as a hippopotamus tail, which they use to fling poop back and forth and swing like that. In fact, there's a couple of videos that we'll be citing in the new book where people have called attention to how cedar trees actually sway just like this in the wind, and how it reminds them of the description of behemoth in the Bible. So Price, in this tome where he was going after Stanhope, decided to go for the jugular, and he had found an example of a sauropod, and I'm going to mispronounce its name. I think it's Brachytrachelopan. That's a short-necked sauropod, which is kind of unusual. Sauropods, by the way, for those of you who are sauropod groupies, you're talking about an enormous number of vertebrae in here, neck vertebrae. And indeed, dinosaurs in general have a remarkable plasticity in their number of neck vertebrae, which is very different from us incredibly boring mammals, where we got like 7 neck vertebrae and there's a couple species with 8, and that's about it. Very, very boring. Manatees, I think, have a one less neck vertebrae. But sauropods can vary, 20, 25 or so, and presumably there's an amino acid duplication or something in a gene. If we had dinosaur DNA, we could check on all of this stuff. Just like our pentadactyl limbs, the number of fingers you have are determined by the number of alanine repeats in your HOX13 gene. 6 alanines, 6 fingers, 5 alanines, 5 fingers, 4 alanines, 4 fingers. Boop, there we go. Simple as that. Anyway, that we could figure a lot of this stuff out as to why the neck varied as it is, but all of the criticism that had been dumped on creationists for this long neck thing, Price decides to be too clever by half by picking on a sauropod with a short neck. See, now he solves this problem. Now, he insists it's still got, quote, with powerful thighs and a large, long tail, unquote. Problem is, Price never actually cites the technical literature on this thing. He just cites a secondary press coverage with a picture that's got a little critter in there and it's got a nice tail and it looks pretty fine and all that. Doesn't say how big it is, because in fact it's one of the smallest of the sauropods. And the small sauropods can get down, into the point of where you're talking below the size of an elephant. This is a small critter. As it happens, the Rahut paper from 2005 that talked about this critter is available at ResearchGate, so I'll be putting that link in so everybody can follow up on it. Maybe Price should have read it because, one, it's one of the smallest of sauropods, evidently adapted to short browsing, which means it wasn't living in a river like Behemoth or on a marsh habitat like Behemoth, which would seem to rule it out as a problem. Second, it's known from South America, which last time I looked is not adjacent to Ararat in Turkey. So how exactly did this Behemoth get to and from there on the ark? Wouldn't it have had to have been on the ark? Can we be a little bit more specific about that? Price skipped that part in his not quite monograph. And then its diminutive size raises the possibility that its tail might have actually been fairly short too, if it's proportioned. Can we figure that out? Oh, darny fudge. It turns out that if you looked at the Rahut paper, you would have seen what bones were found and what ones aren't. None of the tail vertebrae were preserved. None. So they have no direct data on how long the tail was. So how exactly did Price figure this out? Well, evolutionary analysis would suggest that there was probably a tail there of some length, and they might decide on what is a probable one using naturalistic assumptions about extinct animals and all the rest. In other words, the very principle that Price's creationists scream bloody murder about when reconstructing hominids or any other critter. So may we detect a giant double standard here? I think that's a funky little example of how Price is so characteristic of the current branch of popular creationism that is largely web-based, that dangles secondary sources, generally avoids primary sources. It's not as though he had to climb a mountain to find the Rahut paper. This was something that was real easy to have done. And he could have put a direct link in there to that direct paper had he figured it out. But then, of course, that would make it easier for people to find out what I found out, which was that the thing didn't match the point. Now, my favorite for Behemoth is, in fact, the hippo, which I mentioned. It fits the bill beautifully. There's going to be quite an extensive section on it in the volume 2 of The Rocks Were There, because people forget or aren't aware of how hellaciously dangerous hippos are as a critter, that if you want a monster that lives in rivers and is a real dangerous thing to tackle with, hippopotami are perfect examples. They kill more people every year than lions do. And they will attack they're hyper-territorial. And you know what they do? If they show passivity, they just let their tail droop. But if they're really pissed off, they'll tend to stiffen that tail. And they'll also, of course, mark their territory with the little boop, 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 with the poop. So if you happen to encounter a mouth gaping hippo who's getting its tail all in a dither, this is back off, kid. Stay away. This is danger. Now, this is borne out as well by Egyptian mythology. The monster, when you drop dead, your little soul, I can't remember whether it was the Ba or the Ka, one of the multiple part for spirits back in the old Egyptian mythology. Anyway, one of them was measured against a feather by this horrible monster down there in the afterlife. And this horrible monster, if you didn't measure up properly, would devour you. It was part crocodile, part lion, and part hippopotamus. That was the ultimate trifecta. By the way, the crocodile is the king of the hill, for killing critters. That it kills roughly twice as many people per year as hippopotami do, and hippopotami kill about twice as many people as lions and such do. So you can put it on a little pecking order along in there. That if you wanted a trifecta of dangerous animals, crocodile, hippopotamus, lion are a perfect mix. And so the Egyptians got that pretty well right. And a good argument can be made that aspects, at least, of behemoth come from hippopotami, and aspects of Leviathan, the big sea monster thing, come from crocodiles, because the Bible text there also describes scales. It makes it, in fact, it goes overboard on describing how tight-fitting the scales are and how unpierceable all it is. And of course, that connects up with a whole bunch of other little legendary points on here. So any comments, John or Jackson, about this discourse?
A few things come to mind, yeah. For one, I find it strange that they would even try to use this example as, I mean, if this is really scraping the bottom of the barrel. To if you want to find evidence that dinosaurs extended beyond the end Cretaceous event, which for them is pretty recent, and cohabitated the Earth with humans at some point, this is like one of the strangest places to go. This name Behemoth it's not so much a name, but well, it's kind of used that way, I think, just once in the book, and nowhere else. I mean, if
Leviathan pops up several times in various texts, but Behemoth, this is basically Job and nothing.
The reason is, as far as I'm aware, the word behemoth shares its triradical structure, so it shares its etymology roughly with a broader word just meaning beasts of the field, and oftentimes that word is used just to describe, broadly speaking, livestock and things like oxen, cows, or not cows, I'm sorry, but the oxen, the bulls, and so forth, that people might be familiar with in the area. So this is kind of beefing up this general term for beasts and ascribing it to something that's a little bit greater. And I do like the point that Stanhope makes, that it's almost like a mythologizing of the great beasts of the earth that they know.
And as to why creationists make such a big deal out of it, they have no choice, because dinosaurs existed, ergo they were there in the creation week, ergo they must have been on Noah's Ark, ergo their fossil record would be represented in the flood, all of that, all contemporary with humans. So it's got to be somewhere. Okay, Behemoth. And so they simply rewrite the text to fit, or because even the most generous reading has only one translation that says maketh its other than just maketh its tail stiff like a cedar. That they have to interpolate all the rest in a way that they would never tolerate. That would be liberals. That would be a liberal interpretation of scripture, to insert meaning into the text that wasn't there to begin with.
Yeah,
and
I think this particular example is on the level of like flat Earth interpretations. To restrict what we can actually discover about the solar system. It
gets even worse with the Leviathan matter, because Duane Gish had one of the most strained interpretations, and it's only existing in one of the books he did for kids. Like, they're going to be the test case for this. And I'm not sure whether you're aware of his book, Dinosaurs by Design.
I vaguely recall it from a long time ago.
It's a rib tickler. Came out in like 1992. And here, the daisy chain is very complex, what he does with all of this. But mainly, it starts off in the fact that Leviathan breathes fire. Now, that's an interesting feature for a vertebrate in general, which should be brought up somewhere. And so he makes a prima facie case, put on your seatbelts, kids, that the dinosaur Parasaurolophus, that does not live in an aquatic habitat, was actually a fire-breathing dragon. And that its long snout skull tube that regular paleontologists think is probably a resonating chamber for making sounds, was like a reservoir for the chemicals used to make the fire. And the reason why he was bringing all this up was as a way to bring up the bombardier beetle case, which is one of the little tropes that knocks around in the creationist movement. So this was a hop, skip, and a jump. In one of my earlier writings, and I'll be incorporating it into the new book, I was explaining why even the illustration that Gish offered in the book of the skull ruled out any possibility that this was a plausible hypothesis, in addition to the fact that there's no indication of any fire-breathing vertebrates of any type at any time, that this is not a thing. And he never brought this up in his serious stuff that he was doing, the evolution, the fossils still say no, and things like that. And it doesn't really even show up terribly much in the modern apologetics, in part, I think, because it was in print. And to be fair, the standing for truth types aren't the ones who typically like read books. They're scavenging off what's off the internet. So we can see a bifurcation that's going on, even among today. If you look at people like Standing for Truth and Matt Powell and all the rest, they're not name dropping Dwayne Gish and Henry Morris and that Gary Parker set. That
I'm a little disappointed. I always kind of like Henry Morris, and I gotta confess, I think I first learned about the bombardier beetle from Dwayne Gish as a kid.
And he put it all the time in his apologetics. That's one, and there's a whole sub bit, because there's a relationship to the issues about what the moderators and the chemical issues were, and there's back and forth. There's going to be quite an extensive section on it, particularly because there's been a lot of research on the beetles that do that, and the evolution of that system, and the biochemical background and the phylogeny of it all, which only adds to the inadequacy of anti-evolutionists to deal with the thing. But now, the other dinosaur aspect, and here now you're into Carl Baugh Kenthovian territory, is that not merely that there were dinosaurs mentioned in the Bible at the time of the flood, but that they're still alive today, floating around somewhere in Mokembo Babelia, or whatever that's called down there in Africa. And so that brings us into cryptozoology, which is a fringe group that connects up with Bigfoot hunting and Yeti and all of that and sea monsters, and that subculture connects up with a bunch of people in the creationism movement because they want their living dinosaurs. I mean, it would be a coup, the secular, liberal paleontologist, evolutionist, Richard Dawkins, atheist, evil scumbags, refuse to admit that the dinosaurs are still amongst us. Snap pick. Except no one could ever get the snap pick category. And this goes off in just Looney Tunes territory. I was just finally picking up. We have a little show that we run every Friday that the late Cy Strike started, that we dedicated the first book to, and his daughter is picking up the screen as well on these weekly shows that we do, where we look at stupid videos. Usually it's flat earth stuff and all the rest, but the one that we just watched last week was from John Pendleton, who is a young earth creationist acolyte of Carl Baugh, that bunch, who is actively hunting what he believes to be living pterosaurs still alive in Mexico. And he has a GoFundMe to get $5,000 to assemble this plan to tranquilizer dart and capture a living, as he put it, pteranodon dinosaur. Not aware of the fact that pterosaurs and dinosaurs aren't the same group.
That's a solid plan, I think.
Yeah.
We should let him do it.
He's going to get cameras and bait. He's got goats. He wants to put pigs and some sheep and pig's blood and eucalyptus leaves and oil.
I'm sure that's what they feast on.
Eucalyptus. Why he thinks eucalyptus leaves? He's not hunting koalas. Anyway, a Logic, who does some just hilarious videos and that, had done a series on these, and I was just watching them last night as he's going through all this bit. But Pendleton is particularly hilarious because apparently although you would think that pterosaurs are kind of obscure and hard to find these days, as in nobody ever finds them, somehow or other, he manages to positively trip over people who have seen and been attacked by pterosaurs within the last few years. And that they've lived in caves and they've been burned out by their village because they were attacking them, and have swooped down and tried to pick them up off the road just, last year, kinds of things. Now, these he encounters from his maid and the maid's 7-year-old daughter, and of various people, this guy named Adolfo, who is apparently he's encountered. And you have to wonder how many of them are putting him on, for one thing, or he'll bring out a pterosaur book and say, have you seen one of these? And somebody will point out something and go, oh yeah, I saw one of those, meaning a critter that's got like wings. How many of them actually just saw a bird, a vulture, or some such thing out of the corner of their eye? And he's putting up a book, not of ornithology, but of pterosaurs. And so they got to pick something. So there they go. We don't know yet because we don't exactly have detailed transcripts of their various interviews. It's just a pile up of secondary sources.
Yeah, well, I think you made the point before. I mean, if there were some find like this, I mean, no, of course it'd be exciting. It's nothing that anybody's trying to hide. But I think they've really backed themselves in a corner, like you said, by almost demanding, like you said, we if we accept the fossil record of dinosaurs, then we have to accept that they were there on the ark. They have to have been there at least 4,300 years ago, and especially if they're going to claim that Job, among other things, referenced dinosaurs, then they have to say that they're as young as just 2,000 to 3,000 years old.
Yeah. And there's going to be a whole detailed section.
There's zero chance though that animals of this size and shape and form were roaming around with humans in the first and second millennium BC in the ancient Near East without leaving any trace of bone tissue.
In fact, the Romans would have had a terrible incentive. They were like wild animal happy to drag every beast into the gladiatorial games, and they would have animal fights and things.
Right, that would be pretty good.
So they would bring giraffes and other kinds of exotic animals in. If they had found out about any of these things, this would have been a shoe-in.
Yeah, I mean, there's no chance that there's no fossil record of these things if they're as young as 2,000 or 3,000 years old in Earth history. And plus the DNA record. I mean, at this point, we can pull DNA samples from soil, from stuff that's defecating in the soil. And now we've got a DNA record of humans, Neanderthals, and everything else.
Tissue and blood, but not DNA?
Yeah.
What's wrong with this little picture? Yeah, so this brings us into a whole area of the cryptozoology thing. There's a small subculture, which is fun to see how it pops up. It shows up at ICR at little levels. It shows up at AIG, and it shows up at CMI. And boy, does it show up in Roger Patterson and Carl Bauland, which is a whole subculture of supposed living dinosaurs. The Cambodian stegosaur picture, which is just one of the most pathetic examples of these things. If some medieval guy decided to put a snake-like creature with intertwined heads as a tiny little decorative motif on somebody's tomb in 897, along come the creationists insisting that that's an anatomically detailed rendition of a long-necked sauropod that had survived into the Middle Ages in Britain.
Yeah, this is really getting desperate. And I do remember from the 90s, a lot of these works claiming that there were historical accounts or works.
And they're still going strong. They're
they're
still on the websites and all that. They're still doing videos on one of my super duper favorites. And this is where, thank you, internet scholarship, has to do with Leonardo da Vinci. Just a couple years ago, one of the creationists put up on a website, I can't remember whether it was at ICR or one of the others, but he was insisting that Leonardo da Vinci did a drawing of an actual living dragon dinosaur. Bum, bum, bum. Now, this was amusing, and it turns out that there had been some press coverage about this little teeny little blip of it. The fun part is we're now in the internet era. There's background scholarship. And it happened to be that Leonardo's diaries have survived, And his description of how he made this drawing is actually preserved in his writings. And it turns out he's saying, well, yeah, this guy asked me to put some dragons into the picture. Well, I was modeling some of it on lions, and there's things with reptiles that make sense. And he was describing the way he would use for his client to come up, not that he had ever seen a living dragon. Now, the funny again part is, excuse me, if old fart RJ could have found this source material, full text archived in like half an hour, what exactly was preventing the creationists from locating this information?
Oh yeah, that's I mean, are you saying that it's possible for somebody to use their imagination and come up with a chimeric animal that doesn't exist and draw it? Like that?
No, it's
is that a possibility that they don't even consider?
Find this information. Did their little mouse hand suddenly seize up to where they couldn't mouse click and do word searches?
That's it too. I think a lot of it's just echoed back and forth and back and forth. And because somebody in the community has used this before, this reference before,
bingo,
they'll say, there's the authority. It's good enough for him. It's good enough for me. And you can see this pretty, I don't know. Can I share my screen here with you?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. If you've got the menu down there for share screen.
I do. Entire screen. Let's just do this and see if that works. Here's an example I really love from a discussion that you had. Do you remember this image?
I think that, there we go. Oh, yes, that one. That pops up all the time. Yeah.
And see, we got Answers in Genesis copyright down here because they enhance the image for you. Why would they enhance the image? And I love how this inset cuts off exactly this portion, like what's right above the tail, and you could see kind of what's right above the tail, and they make it sound like it's irrelevant. But they'll take a picture like this, which, if you don't know, is a petroglyph from, it's right here, a petroglyph from southern Utah. It's cropped here and enhanced in a way that nobody can look at this and not see a dinosaur. I mean, this immediately makes you think Flintstones. And my favorite part is if you find the original image, like look at this enhancement that they did, the digital enhancement versus the actual image.
Makes sense out of that little puppy. And the problem is that the new analysts have much more sophisticated photographic and analytical material to where now they're coming in. Exactly.
Now you see here, there's no contrast difference between the body and the legs. And look here, the body, this alleged body, and the alleged legs down here. Notice the texturing in the body, that pitted texturing from the original drawing of it, and it's absent down here because these structures, whatever they are not part of the original image. And my favorite part is if you look here, you've got this symbol, this spiral symbol, which is quite common in Southwestern American art. And notice how the tail continues off here and does this windy thing up here. So this symbol generally refers to sources of water. And if you get rid of these legs that aren't actually legs because they're not even part of the image, what you have here is a river meandering its way off into the distance. Like they took a picture that anybody who studies rock art would look at this and say, yeah, there we go. We got a water source. We got a river. This is pretty obvious. They took that and made it into this and passed it around the internet till nobody questioned it. And they're all convinced that there was a sauropod living in Utah within the last few thousand years. So that's about the quality of
our Phil Sentner is somebody who's done oodles of material on this at his Paleontological Electronica and other venues over the years on this. And we're going to be referencing it in the new book as well, in that section on the cryptozoology matter. But this stuff goes all the way back. Paul S. Taylor was one of the early ones back in the 1980s that was pushing a lot of this material. And it just gets recycled iterated in newer material from often a small cluster of people, which then spreads out like wildfire. And then occasionally, some genuine Looney Tunes hoax is one of the ones that was passing around, I think in like 2012 or something. It's been a while ago, but supposedly there was a picture, obviously photoshopped, of a pterodactyl that had been shot down during the Civil War. And so there's these guys in Civil War garb, and there's this great big pterodactyl. You're going, wow, that looks really interesting. And another part, well, of course, we'll be mentioning the Ica stones, which are another matter of contemporary hoaxes. There's just an awful lot of Looney Tunes material on here, and it keeps getting swallowed. I had a debate. You've heard of Standing for Truth, the religious apologist. Yeah, I had a debate with him on, did dinosaurs and people coexisted? And
he used that petroglyph example too.
Yeah, he trotted out a whole bunch of stuff, and I was asking, particularly on this one Australian picture of a plesiosaur that was supposedly being depicted in an Australian find, where did you get this information from? And it was like pulling teeth for him to admit that he got it from a single book that, of course, he had never fact-checked about, and that when people discover what had happened, this painting was a recent painting that was based on an illustration from a dinosaur book that was common in like the 1960s, that was showing the old style of viewpoint on this, even down to the shaping of the exact, how many flippers you could see and all that. It was clearly, you could trace the provenance of this stuff. And Standing was kind of hemming and hawing in the way that he tends to do. And I'm sure if he hears this, because I think he watches the show now and then, he'll probably do a 3-hour epic rant about why I'm completely wrong on all of that stuff, but which he tends to do. There's a lot of time on his hand now that he's not selling used cars. He's got lots of maneuver.
This is a good lesson. I'm trying to remember the term for this. It describes a common phenomenon in which a piece of information which which is not true can the way it gets echoed back and forth around a community, eventually not the original source, but the echoing in the community becomes
a telephone game
right?
would be one way to put that. That's the same bit there. And that's why I always like to follow the daisy chain of things and to see phylogenies. Nick Matsky has done that in some of the terminology that pops up in the intelligent design community, to see how the terms will fission off and somebody's using one version. Oh, in the legislation that's been put up on disclaimers in school books, that there's actually a phylogeny that you can generate off of this. And I kind of do the same sort of a thing to see who's copying from whom. So one technique that you can use is to look at the exact version of the text that's used if it's text string. It's a little different to see what's going on with the visuals. Nephilim Free, for example, would be sticking up images, and when you would ask him where he's getting the sources from, oh boy, forget that. He doesn't like to mention where, because he's forgotten where he's got the material from. But in some cases, you can actually track it down to a particular Andrew Snelling article from like 2015, where that particular image had been up, and he will just cut and paste all of this stuff and put it in their material. So people get into little troughs of apologetics where they're simply drawing on a particular frame, and it incestuously follows, and it never dawns on them to look outside of all of that. And that can get them into serious trouble, even within their own creationist frame, when an issue is actually controversial, and you've got little camps that believe one thing and camps with the other, as you discovered with so many of the things in the heat issue that you were on when you were on Erica's talk about that. It's important to read more than one source, even in the creationist community. Never rely on a single venue, because all you're getting is the little tunnel vision accent point.
This is called the illusory truth effect, by the way. I just recalled. Illusory truth effect. So when you have repeated exposure to something that may be completely untrue, but you've been exposed to it from so many sources that you trust, you can't see, or you're biased against anything that would contradict it, right? So in their mind, like, well, I saw this not only from this author here, and this, but I heard it from this guy over here, and this one in presentation, and this one in another book, and you figure, well, I've seen it in 20 different sources, so it must be true. But that's what happens when you have things echoed off. And sometimes this can be a real danger too. If you have a story that begins, it just becomes viral before anybody checks out what actually happened. You can have legitimate news sources echoing something that never happened, not intentionally misrepresenting the story or the facts, but that's what happens. And by the time you have to correct it, the problem is everyone's seen it so many different places in reliable sources that they think that's true. But this is kind of amplified in that young Earth community, because they just read each other
And it
and
goes
listen to
outside of that. Adrienne Meyer, if you're familiar with her work on fossils and the extent to which that's been filtered into mythology, has made an argument that has been widely repeated and has a certain superficial power to it, that the griffin is a bungled mythologization of fossils of protoceratopsids from the Gobi Desert area and other places along the Silk Road. And there was a logic to it. However, there was recently a paleontologist who went through and wrote a scathing analysis that pointed out, no, this is not, that she was cherry picking the images of griffins and getting some of the chronology wrong and all of that. And so even somebody who is normally fairly reliable and careful can make that. And was particularly ironic with Meyer, because she had made a big deal about pointing out how just such a daisy chain mistake had taken place earlier regarding this idea that there was a reference to the Cyclops coming from fossils, from a reference from Empedocles in ancient Greece, that turned out to be a thing that was just made up out of thin air by a German in the 1930s, that then got copied by Willy Ley. And because Willy Ley was so reliable, and that she had tracked down that this was in fact an unreliable thing, so she was actually caught doing exactly the sort of thing that Willy Ley had been doing, relying on a source that maybe she shouldn't have. So to err is human, to correct requires eternal vigilance and a sound method.
And the willingness to be shown wrong too.
You got to go, it pops up, and in a lot of trivial little things, things get cycled around. There a trope, for example, that iced tea was invented at the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904, and it turns out probably not, that it was served there, but it probably wasn't actually invented there. And so many of these things are urban legend bits, things that we would like to be true. I did kind of a study on this back in the ancient times, 1980s and 90s, regarding some of the tropes about stupid statements about science. One that turned out to actually be true is that Simon Newcomb, the mathematician, did in fact write in 1906 that heavier than air flight was mathematically implausible, that you couldn't build an engine enough to do this. And he was writing this 3 years after the Wright brothers had actually flown. So it was a little bit of a problem. Another one that turned out to actually be true was the rockets won't operate in a vacuum snark that the New York Times offered to complain about this silly Robert Goddard guy talking about making rocket ships to go into space. I mean, every school child knows that rockets don't operate in a vacuum. But others turned out to be fictitious. There's ones about someone saying that the patent office would have to be shut down because we've invented everything. That one apparently is apocryphal. That there's a bunch of these things that would then get cycled around, and then if Bill Gates mentioned it, well, then it would have a whole new life on there. And that just goes to show how difficult it is at times. An example that we did with a creationist that was a delight, because I didn't think I would ever be able to fact check it. We did a whole section, Jackson and I, on vestigial organs and the discussion of that in the anti-evolution biz. And David Menton, the dentist creationist, who is one of the most pompous ones, and he's been writing for decades. He's one of the old guard in there. Anyway, he happened to make a snark about this old 1890s book from this guy Wiedersheim, who had put all these examples of vestigial forms on the list, and people were copying them. And even Wikipedia was repeating that kind of an argument. Well, it turns out, miracle of miracles, Wiedersheim's book had been archived at Project Gutenberg, and so I downloaded the bloody thing. And it turns out none of the claims being made about Wiedersheim's book were accurate. That he had not said what he had been claimed to, that he was actually very meticulous and careful about the reasoning of why something might have qualified as a vestigial form and why within the narrow confines. Of course, Menton was going overboard, because their argument in the creationist community is that to be vestigial means it can have no function, when it only means it doesn't do what it used to, because it's evolved into a different ballpark, and they tend to leave that part out. But given that the Wiedersheim was writing before genetics, and when a lot of these things hadn't even been studied, like the thyroid, He was actually pretty damned accurate. It was a remarkably detailed book that I have to give him kudos. He does not deserve a bad reputation. Thank you very much. And that reminds us about the fact that don't even if it's from a source that you've been relying on. Stephen Jay Gould is an example of somebody who made some snarks about the racist Morton and his brain measurements back in the 19th century. And somebody went through and actually looked at the original measurement data that Morton had. And it didn't mean Morton wasn't a flaming racist, but Gould was wrong. Morton had actually been very careful about his measurements. And so that if you want to go after him for one thing, but inaccurate data was not quite what the problem was in there. And so that anybody can make that kind of mistake. Anybody can go shooting off the thing. Alfred Wallace, the co-founder of Natural Selection Evolution, got on the anti-vaxxer gig in his later years, and also had a soft spot for phrenology. So, people can have that. And Darwin himself had some of his baggage. He was a hypochondriac, possibly because he had some physical illnesses that he had not been properly diagnosed. Complicated. Human beings are complicated that way. And so it's always good to find out what the original source material is, get caught up on the scholarship. You brought up earlier about the fact of the reliance on dated sources, that if somebody is writing in 2015 and they're drawing on something from 1990, particularly in a scientific topic, you're going like, there's been nothing on this in the last quarter of a century? What do they live in a cave? That should always be a dead giveaway.
Yeah, I've noticed this weird double standard, especially on creationists, when it comes to peer-reviewed literature. Like, I will, make an effort to cite all sorts of resources when addressing a particular topic, and they always have a way of kind of dismissing, like, there's a reason I'm not going to even look at these 30 sources, or that, there's got to be something wrong with them. But if they find a peer-reviewed source that apparently supports what they're saying, they will throw it in your face like, how can you not trust or not believe everything that's written in a peer-reviewed article? And I have to say, like, you got the way peer review works, or the way peer-reviewed publications work, we know that a lot of them are wrong in their conclusions. We know that because they don't all come to the same conclusion, and that's fine, because it is, in the end, a discussion where one's saying, I propose this, I hypothesize this, I tested it with these data, expand on it if you can do better. And people will do better, and then they might come back and support it, they might come back, contradict it, find that, well, yeah, that's true over there, but that's not the case in this part of the world, where in this rock layer or in this organism, whatever it may be. So when you're quoting, when you see quotes from like old sources, sometimes it might be from the 70s and 80s, because that's when the original work was done, when we developed a technique to go and measure details about the geochemistry of Earth's crust. Like, that's work that was done in the 70s and 80s.
Seminal work that you give a nod to precisely because it's such an important one in the field.
Right, but I think oftentimes what people do is they'll like find the article or track it down, maybe find it in Google Scholar, and they read it, and it's like from 1985. There's some issue. This dating method is problematic. This fossil record is problematic. These stuff that this doesn't agree.
They're Google searching for buzzwords.
Yeah, and what you always should do, regardless of why you're citing a source here, look at what else has cited that paper since that time, especially
and what
if it's
the
an older
person has
source.
done since. That it's perfectly feasible for scientist X to have written a particular work in 1985, and then 10 years later they go, oops, boy, we learned new information. I've sure changed my view.
Yeah, I've got to update
some
of my stuff that I've published as well. Not that it's totally wrong, but we adjust it with new data a little bit, and that's fine. So we've got to
this
type
is
myself.
exactly the flaw with an awful lot of creationist secondary apologetics on the flood, where and Noah's Ark, is that you find a bunch of ones today in the 21st century that will be quoting stuff from John Morris on Noah's Ark or John Morris on Paluxy River tracks, written early in the career, and seemingly unaware that, boy, has John Morris changed his mind on all of that since, and was not quiet about it either. The Paluxy River tracks in that as well. Now, and so what will often happen, you encounter the fossilized brain problem. And this is much more likely to occur with old farts like me. It's a different dynamic with a young fart like Standing for Truth, who's only in like his 30s or so. But an old fart from my generation will have been reading their Henry Morris and their Dwayne Gish and their Luther Sunderland, and they have remembered all of this stuff, and the books have been stuck away, and they have cobwebs, and they forgot where they put them, but little bits and pieces of it have stuck around in their head. So when they are bringing out tropes, it'll be the tropes that they had imbibed way back when, and they haven't figured out that it's like the 21st century. You're still talking about speciation when modern creationism accepts hyperspeciation. Don't you keep up with baraminology and all of that? When you get into the Standing for Truth, Matt Powell, raw mat mode, Nephilim free, now you're in the internet trawler category. And one of the ones I love to play with, I'll point off screen where I keep my books, in Evolution Slam Dunk, because the reason why everyone needs to get the book is because I did something no one had done before, which was catalog all of the creationist coverage up to that time of the reptile-mammal transition, which wasn't much. Only about 20 people in the anti-evolution biz have ever bumped in one form or another to the reptile-mammal transition. And every one of them screws up, and you get to see exactly why. Well, if somebody is aware of the whole field, they would know about Dwayne Gish and Philip Jeanson and others, but those are all in books. That requires physically reading a book. They're not online. None of that stuff's online. So if they're an online trawler, they won't know it exists. They will have no idea what Philip Jeanson did about this in Darwin on Trial, or what Dwayne Gish was talking about in Evolution, the Fossils Still Say No. If they Google it, you know what's going to come up? John Woodmarat from 2001 Answers in Genesis. That's the top Google thing. And so I just analyzed in detail exactly how he screwed up on every single one of his primary points. But so I'm always waiting, if somebody is jousting with me online when I bring up the reptile-mammal transition, are they going to mention John Woodmarat or not? And odds are that's who they're going to link to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the whole community is kind of taking a gentle turn downhill. It was a little bit more interesting back in the day when it was a matter of publishing and reading hard copy sources and using libraries, and oftentimes, at least to their credit, if you read somebody like Morris and Gish, they made an attempt to cite sources. Doesn't necessarily mean.
Well, they literally had no other alternative in there. When you get down into the raw mat Standing for Truth world, you have what is in effect a blog vomit, complete with internet links, hyperlinks, in a printed book. That all they've done is just take their stuff and turn it into a PDF file for publication at Amazon.com. Sorry, that's not how this works.
Right. Yeah, and I don't know. By the way, speaking of, you mentioned having to read a book. The other day I discovered a VCR, like a tape recording of a presentation. No, it was a Gish Doolittle debate. That was it.
Oh, wow!
That was back in the day.
Smokes. Yeah. Do you physically have that?
I still do. It's
if
in a
you
closet,
can generate a DVD of that is important, because I don't think that's available anywhere to see. There are little snippet conversation stuff, but that has disappeared from the archive. There's no video. There's only tiny little snippets of it. It should show up in any context whatsoever. If you have the entire effing Gish debate on that,
I don't have a VCR here to test it, but I will check into that. I've got two of them. If you can get a DVD
knocked off of that, that would be important to have available for scholars, because that is really unobtainable.
I didn't realize. I've got two of them. One was with Doolittle. I can't remember what the other one was.
But, this was stuff that Gish did. Gish debated all over the landscape. I have a whole stash of material on the debate issue. and who is debating with who and when and all that, and everything is also it's a whole thing that's eventually going to be in a future book where I'll be dealing with the structure of it. And that was one where for all practical purposes, there's almost nothing archived for people to look at. The best you can do is a few of the debates have transcripts that you can actually hear. Dwayne Gish debated Hugh Ross, for example, and the transcript of that has been available. But the actual videos end of it, we are not worthy. You got to get that thing DVDized.
I'll do my best. I'll see. Yeah,
there are places that'll convert that. I'm sure somebody in a media department in a university or something will probably have all the equipment to do that, easy peasy.
Yeah, that'd be good. I'll get on that. Thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah. I as a scholar take note of all of this stuff, and so when things pop up to where I want to see, there was an example. In our community, she had collected a staggering amount of the primary source material, particularly regarding Kent Hovind, the original books that he would allude to from all of these different sources. And then she died of a sudden seizure. And we have no idea what happened to all of that material because it's in boxes somewhere. Whereas at least in some of my material now, I'm trying to get stuff into physical books that people can buy, into stuff that's posted online, in links that you can get to, so people can make use of it. Because if I had written nothing and I'm suddenly struck by a truck, boop, it just disappears. It's nothing. It's as if it didn't exist at all. And so to get all of that into the scholarly field, just like Dapper Dino, who picked up after Bill Ludlow died, who had been interviewing ex-creationists as an archival thing to get their testimony on field, to find out, because different people have different journeys as to where they came from in and out of all of this subculture. And it's, from a historian's point of view, it's goldmine material to get into their heads so that they can freshly recollect what they thought of, what works were important to them, who had they heard. All of that stuff is archival material. And Dapper has been continuing that process in interviewing people on that. So everybody's got a part to play. We now have the magic box, the fantastic computers, the websites, the cloud. We want to get as much information as possible in as many formats as possible, preserved in as many ways as possible, so it can be studied by people who may not even realize the questions. We don't know what questions people will be asking about this. Who said such and so about such and so? If the information isn't accessible, how can they find that? So it's all part of a big picture, Jonathan. So we're past the hour. I think, is there any final thoughts you have to say? We will in absentia say, Jackson, wonderful for you to be here briefly. And
yeah, study your sources and figure out how to follow up on sources. Publications are part of a broad discussion. When something gets published, that doesn't mean it's the end of things. I mean, any paper out there can be challenged, and that's why we publish them. So it's a good skill to learn. If you want to study a topic, you don't just write that topic into Google and pick out the first few things that pop up. Even Google Scholar. Google Scholar is a very useful tool, but pay attention to.
Same thing with Wikipedia. It's a portal. It's a doorway. It's not a destination.
Right.
You're only starting up on that. And be sure to lob me on Twitter the links to your website and anything else you need to have shill plugged that I can stick into the links in the video description.
Yeah, not much right now. We'll see if I end up doing anything. Anybody who's interested in hearing my opinion, that's something I can go to.
And at some point, once we finish all of the various chapters, the geology stuff, then we'll want to lob that text to you so that you can go through it with a fine-tooth comb to make sure that we have absolutely no errors. Steve Bauman is another geologist that we had doing material on the first book, and he'll be doing that on the second. There's a lot of geology in the flood geology chapter, and then there's a whole chapter we're going to be doing on the paleo worlds that never were, the contrast between the actual paleogeography, that's just astonishing amount of work that's been done, and the cartoon version that's occurring over in Andrew Snelling and John Woodmarapp and all of their little land with their playing with stuff and Clary's stupid mega sequences and all that stuff. There'll be a lot of stuff on there.
No, I think you got a lot of good topics. It'll be fun to see what you come up with.
Yeah. Let me put up a little blip here. I'd like to hear a skeptic make an intelligent argument about this whole UFO thing, not the usual mockery that skeptics are well known for. Well, Mr. White, I'll say this. I think that the latest flap that's come out about UFOs is, to my mind, reeks of an instrumentation oddity. That you've got these things where the pilots are flying at high speed and making dives and turns, and something is popping up on their sensors, and they've got this little blob that's showing up on the only thing they're really noticing, which is their heads-up screen, and it's fixed right in the middle of the thing. They're moving along, and the landscape is shifting. That sounds to me like an instrumental eccentricity. And they can't deny it now because it happens too frequently, and people get bootleg footage that gets put out. And so it's in the internet, so they have to deal with it. But they have to be very cagey because they don't want to say, our instrumentation is glitching out. And away we go on that. Do I think that aliens from Andromeda are popping in and buzzing F-15s and that around the world? Not particularly. That would seem an implausible operation on that. The reason why these things supposedly can instantaneously accelerate is they may not actually be there to begin with. And so it's an interesting issue. It doesn't mean that anybody is not seeing what they're seeing or experiencing what they're experiencing. But we know that in a stressful position, your brain will filter what you think you're seeing in a way that's the counterpart of the moon illusion, where even when you know the bloody moon is not bigger on the horizon than it is up at the zenith, your brain still tells you that anyway. It automatically overrides the processing. And I think an awful lot of that is what's going on in there. Now, if the equivalent of Klaatu suddenly lands on the White House lawn and steps out, that changes everything. But until that happens, all we're getting is circumstantial anecdotes of weird things that you see in the sky. And I'm much more in line to think that it's an instrumental eccentricity and the occasional physical object that one encounters. And maybe once in a while, a genuine terrestrial thing of some advanced rocketry thing, something that's coming out of the Russians, something that's coming out of Area 51, something that Lockheed will be getting a big contract for 15 years down the line, et cetera, et cetera. That was part of the case with the early sightings of stealth planes and stealth bombers in a long lead up time to their development. But aliens from outer space, don't hold your breath. So, final words, Jonathan?
Well, I think we can. Well, if anybody hasn't, read the article by Stanhope. If you get the links to that, it's a really.
I'll be sticking all that up once this finalizes.
And I think it's long been known. He does a great job summarizing it, but it's long been known that the behemoth is kind of a broader term for a grazing animal, a large grazing animal that could get an erection. And
plus, he's hilarious. It's a beautifully, funnily written thing. Frankly, compared to Mr. Price, who's kind of a drab. Anyway, so thank you for being here today. You're a welcome guest to come in, especially on geological subjects, to thrash all the material over. We are now ending the screen. As you can see, I'm turning into a melted puddle here in 90 degrees.
I appreciate it.
Yeah, that's why.